Getting married for the first time after 40? That's just not happening. An old maid rushing to get married is still an old maid. Seriously, it's just embarrassing. And if it was a shotgun wedding, I might forgive it, but getting married after 40 without even being pregnant. Living with my in-laws, suddenly, my sister-in-law, let's call her Emily, came back home after getting divorced. Emily, who initiated the divorce, acted like she had won some sort of prize. She declared that dumping a useless man was only natural, blaming the divorce entirely on her ex-husband. Emily, now back, would do nothing but laze around, receiving an allowance from our mother-in-law and going out at night. Eventually, she announced she was getting remarried and that I should leave because she's going to have a successor. Remarried? To that person? That's just not possible, right? When I fought back, Jennifer flew into a rage as if she had gone mad. But there was a shocking secret about Jennifer. An unexpected series of events followed, leading to a dramatic turn of events that plunged my mother-in-law, caught in the crossfire, and Jennifer into an unimaginable outcome. My husband and I met after both of us had turned 40 and decided to get married. We had both prioritized our careers over romance, which is why we didn't realize how quickly we had reached 40. Having similar values, we hit it off well from the start. We hadn't considered marriage before, because my husband was the eldest son. Since he hadn't married by 40, his parents had given up on the idea of grandchildren and told us not to worry about it. He later mentioned he was happy without children in our marriage. When we met his parents, they were very friendly and said that marriage was a matter between the individuals involved. Encouraged by their words, we decided to get married. Both of us had lived alone for a long time, so we took our time discussing our new home. His parents even suggested we consider living with them, as they had a spare room. Having lived alone longer than I had with my own parents, I found it hard to make an immediate decision. What would it be like to live with the older generation? I simply couldn't imagine it. My husband chuckled at the thought of moving back home. However, considering the peace of mind of being close to aging parents, he began to lean towards living with them. After many visits to his parents' house and spending weekends there, we tried to see if we could agree with his idea. His father was very kind and considerate towards me. My mother-in-law has a bit of a sarcastic way of speaking, but I came to realize that she's like that with everyone, including my father-in-law and my husband. Once I understood that it's just her personality, it started to bother me less. I figured I could handle this, and 6 months after getting married, we started living with my in-laws. My mother-in-law has been a stay-at-home wife for a long time and handles all household chores competently. After retiring, my father-in-law had been rehired to work 3 days a week, but after we moved in, he decided to quit his job completely and enjoy his retirement. He's always eager to help around the house and spends his days taking walks and enjoying himself. Although my mother-in-law is strict about household chores, I never felt bad about it. She may be harsh or sarcastic at times, but as long as I did what she asked, she was in a good mood. She's not a perfectionist and often opts for time-saving methods in her chores. With the time she saves, my mother-in-law enjoys watching foreign romantic dramas. She looks so happy when she's watching them, and I've come to believe that she's not a bad person at heart. Maybe I wanted to believe that's just how she is. A year into living with my in-laws, we were doing well and had a happy household filled with laughter. Until my sister-in-law arrived. One day, as we were about a year into our cohabitation, my 38-year-old sister-in-law, let's call her Emily, suddenly returned to my in-laws' house after getting divorced. It seems she got divorced and came back. My sister-in-law is the one who left her husband, and often boasts about the saga of her divorce. Though some things made me go, I heard that divorce is harder than getting married and she probably had her struggles leading up to it. I didn't pry too much into Emily's tales of heroism and just listened lightly. If you only listened to Emily, she was the one who initiated the divorce, and her ex-husband was to blame for the breakdown of their marriage. Yet, she didn't receive any alimony or her share of the property division. Isn't that awful? I mentioned that she could still claim her share of the property after the divorce, but Emily said, "I don't want anything from that man," and that was that. If Emily's story is true, shouldn't the property division be her right? Or was the guy so bad that she wanted to be rid of him as soon as possible? Marriage issues are complex and only those involved truly understand, so my husband said we should just watch and see, and I agreed. However, even after 6 months since Emily returned, she continued to act like a guest in her own home. She doesn't do any chores, still receives an allowance from our mother-in-law at 38, and makes expensive purchases. Eventually, even my husband couldn't overlook it anymore and confronted our mother-in-law, suggesting that giving Emily an allowance was coddling her too much. My mother-in-law said Emily had her fair share of struggles in her marriage, so she thinks this much is okay. Plus, she said my sister-in-law came back with a broken heart, so it's pitiful not to listen to my husband's advice. If you just hear that, you might agree. Since the time it takes to heal emotional wounds varies from person to person. But, it's true that there's been some tension in the family. My husband and I decided to seek my father-in-law's opinion. He was calm and offered his view fairly. He told Emily it's okay to stay until she's settled, but reminded her that this house is also where we, as a couple, live. He told her to not stay at home and help out with the house or get a part-time job to make ends meet. He made it clear that she should plan to move out once she's able to. However, for Emily, it seemed like a bunch of grievances since no one, apart from my mother-in-law, seemed to be on her side or sympathize with her for being hurt by the divorce. "You know, my place was originally where I could gain something, but now, because of a woman over 40 joined, I have nowhere to belong." Really? My own daughter is about to be driven out of this house. Ever since you came, Dad has been on your side. The outsider is you, so don't butt in. Emily started attacking me along with my mother-in-law, fueled by her dissatisfaction of not getting her way. Furthermore, Emily began feeding lies to my mother-in-law about me. She claimed I was bad-mouthing my mother-in-law behind her back. "You've been spreading around the neighborhood that my clothes smell like an old lady." She also spread rumors that I was seen walking with a younger man, that I'm a big spender, and that my cooking is too salty, accusations I knew nothing about. At first, I countered, saying I hadn't said such things, perhaps it was a misunderstanding, but then Emily played a voice recording that sounded like me, speaking ill of my mother-in-law. In this day and age, with minimal knowledge, anyone can create fake audio or videos using apps. When my father-in-law caught Emily and my mother-in-law attacking me, he defended me and exposed Emily's deeds in front of my mother-in-law. He has a background in IT and is proficient with smartphones. He demonstrated how easy it was to create a fake voice recording, using an app to make it sound like Emily was bad-mouthing my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law understood that it was easy to fake, but she suspected that my father-in-law and I were conspiring behind her back. My mother-in-law acts politely when my father-in-law and husband are around, but the moment they're gone, she doesn't miss a chance to throw sarcastic comments my way. "Everyone over 40 is an old lady. Better not think of yourself as young forever." Exactly. Once you're less than 20 years away from 60, you're definitely an old lady. Approaching middle age, one doesn't need to be told about the physical decline they're experiencing. But, I don't think Emily has any right to say such things to me. You'll be in your 40s and called an old lady in just 2 more years too. I felt it was a waste of time and effort to engage with them, so I decided to ignore them. Then, my mother-in-law and sister-in-law, let's call her Emily, escalated from just verbal jabs to more excessive actions. I continued my job after getting married, which my husband understood. When we decided to live with my in-laws, they were okay with it, so my lifestyle didn't change much even after Emily came back. Since my homecoming hours varied, they couldn't time their harassment to match my return. They started to mess with me while I was sleeping, like hiding or dirtying all my shoes for work, which was just the beginning. My father-in-law is the earliest to rise in the morning. He sometimes goes for early walks, and my mother-in-law would prepare breakfast to match his schedule. My husband and father-in-law would have breakfast together, and I'd eat around the time they finished. The reason for the time difference is that my father-in-law and husband prefer simple breakfast, while my mother-in-law, Emily, and I prefer full-blown breakfast. Once my father-in-law and my husband finish and leave the table, I'm served a coffee that seems to only have color, like hot water barely tinted with coffee. They've tried various ways to harass me, like altering only my portion of food to taste strange. But I ate it all without showing any reaction. Because they weren't doing anything that could cause poisoning. Their harassment focused on the mornings, and since I was busy getting ready for work, I didn't have time to point out every little thing. Plus, the times it was just the three of us were limited, and I didn't want to worry my kind father-in-law, who was always considerate. I thought Emily would eventually leave, and once she did, my mother-in-law might change her attitude. But an incident pushed me to my limit. It happened on a day when my father-in-law and husband were both out, and I had the day off from work. That's when Emily and my mother-in-law came at me with insults. All this talk about work. Pretending to be a career woman, but aren't you just the cleaning lady at the company? Those calls you get, they're just telling you off or warning you, right? It's because you try to compete with men that you end up unmarried till 40 and then rush into marriage. I wish you'd consider the inconvenience to those of us who have to take in a daughter-in-law over 40. My mother-in-law suggests I'm just after my husband's income, deceiving him to get close. She says it's my parents' fault for raising a woman who's deluded into thinking she's competent at her job. My mother-in-law and Emily proudly start lecturing that what's really important for a woman is to be charming and loved by men. The reason I didn't marry until after 40 has nothing to do with my parents. It was simply my own choice. Furthermore, my mother-in-law belittled my parents, suggesting it's no wonder given the kind of neglectful upbringing I supposedly had. My parents never neglected me. I countered, saying it's wrong to twist the truth and speak ill of those not present. It doesn't matter about your parents. You can tell everything about the parents by looking at how their child turned out. More importantly, find a place to live as soon as possible. No matter how much we talk about the age of late childbirth, having a baby in your late 50s is just not happening. My daughter will remarry and have a child, so she'll be staying here. You'll have to leave. I had an inkling why they were suddenly so adamant about kicking me out. A little while ago, we discussed the deteriorating condition of the family home and decided to rebuild it. My mother-in-law and sister-in-law, let's call her Emily, planned to keep living in the new house and push me out. They told my father-in-law that I had been relentlessly harassing Emily. Beyond what was bearable. I couldn't believe they would think my father-in-law would take their word for it, and I couldn't help but laugh at their futile efforts. Just then, my father-in-law and husband returned home, as if on cue. Immediately, in front of me, my mother-in-law and Emily started their act, tearfully claiming that Emily had suffered terrible treatment at my hands. Their performance was so wooden at times that I struggled to hold back laughter. My father-in-law and husband didn't believe a word from my mother-in-law and Emily, confidently stating I would never do such things. My mother-in-law questioned how they could be so sure without seeing anything, to which my husband countered. They asked if she really didn't know me well enough after over a year of living together to know I'm not capable of hurting others. My father-in-law pointed out that everything was fine until Emily returned, suggesting something was off with my mother-in-law's sudden change. He even wondered aloud if my mother-in-law was being blackmailed into siding with Emily. Feeling cornered, my mother-in-law started to lose her resolve, while Emily became increasingly desperate in her claims. Look at this injury on my knee. She pushed me, and I got this wound because of her. My husband looked puzzled. Didn't you say you got that injury from falling off your bike? I heard you talking about it with Mom. My husband explained that at that time he took a bandage from the first aid kit and handed it to my sister-in-law. Emily then claimed it was a different injury, saying she had grazed the healing wound again. Suddenly, my mother-in-law backed her up, as if remembering the same story. My husband pressed for evidence, asking Emily to show the wound by removing the bandage, arguing that the healing process of a scrape is recognizable to anyone with common sense. When were you pushed? Today? Yesterday? My sister-in-law, let's call her Emily, repeated her poor act, unsure if it was yesterday or today, with her memory seemingly fuzzy. She desperately tried to cover up the lie, knowing it would be exposed if her injury was seen, and even attempted to change the subject, but my husband and father-in-law were much more adept at pointing out inconsistencies. Enough already! A wife who suggests rebuilding our home for me and Mom wouldn't do such a thing. My mother-in-law and Emily, having thought it was my husband and father-in-law who proposed the rebuild, showed puzzled expressions to us. In reality, considering the aging condition of the home and thinking about my aging in-laws, I was the one who suggested remodeling to make the house more livable in their old age. My parents passed away early, without me having much chance to show my gratitude to them. Seeing how considerate and kind my father-in-law, who reminded me of my own father's willingness to help those in trouble, I wanted to show him the filial piety I couldn't show my own father by treating him as my second real father. When I told my husband this, he was moved to tears and expressed his gratitude. Truth be told, I intended to use my personal savings for the remodel, primarily for my father-in-law's sake, with my mother-in-law feeling like an afterthought. Yet, unaware of my intentions, my mother-in-law and Emily accused me of not contributing financially and said it was meaningless to make suggestions if I was just going to stay put. My husband and father-in-law were furious. They questioned if they hadn't heard that I was covering the full cost. But my mother-in-law and Emily refused to believe what my husband and father-in-law said, arguing that it was impossible for a woman who married into the family to have such a significant amount of money. Both were present during the discussions about the home remodel, but were probably too preoccupied with thoughts of how to oust me to pay attention. In their minds, they had concluded, the remodel is settled, yay! It will be paid for with my husband's bonus and my father-in-law's retirement fund. In fact, I am a company president, and I had explained my job and position when I married into the family. However, my mother-in-law clung to the belief that a woman's work could only be as menial as serving tea or answering phones, failing to escape this outdated notion. In this day and age, no company limits women's roles to just serving tea and answering phones. Doing so would raise numerous issues, something my mother-in-law completely failed to grasp. I hadn't introduced myself to Emily with "I'm a president," but I would answer if asked. Emily seemed to have her own misconceptions, considering me nothing more than a slightly upgraded part-time worker. Well, they went as far as to say I was the janitor at my company when belittling me. My mother-in-law and sister-in-law, let's call her Emily, can't think of women's work beyond outdated stereotypes. But the company I run as president was my father's, and I merely took over after he passed away. I didn't start the business, so I don't brag about it as much. I suggested my father-in-law quit his job, and I assured him he didn't need to work so hard anymore, because he seemed worn out from working just to make ends meet. He had worked hard for his family for years, and I thought it was time he could lay down that burden. With just the four of us, my income was more than enough to support us all. The only reason you two can lounge around and shop without a care is thanks to your daughter-in-law's earnings. Emily's extravagant spending was something my husband also helped manage. In reality, it was a scheme where my mother-in-law would claim not to have enough for living expenses, and my husband would cover it. My mother-in-law and Emily could spend freely only because of my earnings, and the home remodel they were looking forward to wouldn't happen if they drove me out. Once they realized this, they suddenly changed their tune and started sweet-talking me. So, if you're saying I have to leave, that's fine, but you do know the pillars and such are pretty badly deteriorated, right? There's even talk the roof might cave in. When I knocked on a pillar with my fist, making it creak, Emily screamed. My mother-in-law desperately clung to me, pleading not to damage the house because it might break. Later, after exchanging looks, my mother-in-law and Emily apologized to me, though it didn't seem heartfelt. But I didn't think they were sincerely sorry. They just bowed their heads as a gesture, seemingly plotting to stay on my good side until the renovation was done, after which they'd probably try to kick me out again. I was dismayed by their transparent actions. Without me saying anything, my mother-in-law and Emily started making excuses on their own. "We shouldn't have said you had to leave. I must have misunderstood. My daughter has always been a bit scatterbrained." Right. This injury was from falling off my bike. The pushing part was just confused with a drama scene I had just finished watching. Basically, my mother-in-law was duped by Emily's mistake. And Emily had blurred the lines between reality and fiction. "But you both have been saying this kind of stuff all the time, haven't you?" I picked up my smartphone and played back numerous instances of their verbal abuse. I had been recording their tirades just in case something like this happened. And these recordings were not faked. By chance, I had even captured on video their conversation about Emily remarrying and having an heir. My husband had anticipated that either my mother-in-law or Emily might try to leverage the renovation against us. I had hidden cameras placed around the kitchen area where my mother-in-law, let's call her Susan, Emily, and I frequently gathered, hoping to catch something on film, just in case. When I matched my recordings with the scenes fortunately captured on video, proving none were fake, my father-in-law erupted in fury. My husband had suspected something but was overwhelmed by the extent of it, feeling ashamed and disappointed to be related by blood to Susan and Emily. Unbeknownst to me, my husband and father-in-law had already warned Susan and Emily about their treatment towards me. Susan and Emily had never taken these warnings seriously, always finding ways to dodge responsibility or make excuses without showing any real intention to change. But now, with undeniable evidence in hand, escape was impossible. My husband declared he could no longer allow me to live with Susan and Emily. He decided to take me and leave. My father-in-law agreed, thinking it was the best course of action. I was touched and surprised by how much my husband and father-in-law cared to make such a firm decision on my behalf. Then, Susan began clinging to my husband, asking if he would really abandon his aging mother. Emily started making excuses, claiming her mean actions were just her way of showing affection in a twisted manner. They pleaded with us not to leave, saying they wanted us to stay and live in the house. My father-in-law asked us, in front of Susan and Emily, if we would like to continue living in the house. They eagerly nodded in agreement to it. Then, my husband and father-in-law insisted that Susan and Emily leave. "If you want us to stay, it's only reasonable that you two are the ones to leave. It's impossible for my wife and you two to live together. It was your request for us not to leave and to keep living here. We're fulfilling that wish, so you two have to leave." Faced with the prospect of being the ones asked to leave, Susan and Emily desperately clung to my husband and father-in-law. My father-in-law firmly shook off Susan's clinging hands and bluntly told her to sign divorce papers before leaving. Pushed into a corner, Susan turned to me, pleading. Emily also persisted, asking me to convince my husband and father-in-law. "The renovation was for your father, not for Emily. I might have thought of you, Susan, as an afterthought, but instead of stopping Emily's rampage, you joined her in directing hostility towards me. Living with people we dislike only brings us down, right? I would rather live without one of them than force myself to spend time with someone I don't like, wouldn't you?" I also added that it would be easier to live without either of them than with someone I don't like, and rejected their wishes. Susan and Emily were faced with the choice of living in a potentially collapsing old house by themselves or finding somewhere else to live while they still could. They were left with no choice but to leave, having no means to fund a home renovation on their own. In my mother-in-law's mind, even after a divorce, she'd get a share of the assets and alimony, plus a small pension. She thought Emily would work, so they wouldn't struggle to survive. Later, they would realize how naive that thought was. There were moments when my husband and father-in-law weren't around, and it was just me with my mother-in-law and Emily. During those times, they threatened me, saying they knew what would happen if they were kicked out. After several threats, I got fed up and retorted that nothing they did or said would change the situation. That's when my mother-in-law threw raw eggs at me. These hit me in the head and broke on impact, leaving me covered in eggs. As I looked away from her, she tried to grab me. But my father-in-law happened to pass by and shouted, "What are you doing?" reacting to his voice, my husband saw me drenched in eggs and pushed my mother-in-law away. She stumbled, stepping on the broken shells, and cried out in pain. Emily, meanwhile, only laughed and recorded me with her phone, saying how hilarious it was. Leaving a jobless mother-in-law and an unwilling to work Emily was bound to cause trouble. So, my husband and father-in-law decided to let them stay in the house until they found jobs, but only for a month. However, the egg incident made them lose all patience, demanding they leave immediately. My father-in-law threw my mother-in-law's clothes and bag into the yard and forcefully dragged her out. My husband threw Emily's luggage out of a second-story window. Emily, desperately clinging to the porch, begged me to do something, but I firmly closed the shutters after simply saying, "Take care." There was no reason for me to listen to Emily's wishes when she would cozy up in convenience and quickly turn hostile. However, I remembered something I had forgotten to tell Emily, slightly opened the window, and her face lit up, thinking she was forgiven. "Oh, I almost forgot to mention, you've got an alimony claim coming from your ex-husband and your affair partner's wife." Emily's face turned pale. I had been suspicious of her divorce reasons and had my husband hire a detective agency to investigate. Emily had an affair knowing the man was married and got scared of being discovered. "If you're afraid of getting caught, you shouldn't have had the affair in the first place," I wanted to say. Scared, Emily brought up another reason for the divorce to her ex-husband. She had been going out on the pretext of receiving an allowance from my mother-in-law, but in reality, she was meeting her lover. "We need to get divorced right away before it gets out," she begged her ex, wanting to avoid the hassle of dividing assets. Later, her ex, doubting the unusual divorce, had a detective agency conduct Emily's background investigation. I discovered the truth about my sister-in-law's affair. Around the same time, the wife of the man she was involved with also suspected her husband's odd behavior and hired the same detective agency I did. That's why I had no reservations about directing my anger at Emily. Incidentally, Emily's reason for divorce was supposedly because our father-in-law needed home care, and she was begged to come back home. Emily's ex-husband was willing to help with the care, but she lied about our father-in-law not wanting a man's help and got a divorce instead. Don't just make up that our father-in-law needs care. I despise people who fabricate a family member's misfortune as an excuse to run away. After being kicked out, Susan and Emily ended up crashing at Susan's niece's place, at least for the time being. However, the niece and Emily never got along well and were quickly turned away. With no other option, Emily pawned some jewelry sent by her affair partner for lodging money for the day. She boasted about the jewelry's value, but it turned out to be cheap and worth almost nothing. Eventually, the divorce between our father-in-law and Susan was finalized. Susan had hoped for a significant share of the assets, but it didn't turn out as she expected. She had squandered our father-in-law's retirement funds on lavish spending. In exchange for not demanding repayment, the asset division was offset. Penniless Susan and incapable Emily resorted to reselling some of Emily's extravagant purchases just to get by. When the resellable items started to dwindle, Emily would get a job but was quickly fired due to her habit of unexcused absences. Only the fear of ending up homeless motivated her to work, but she wouldn't unless absolutely necessary. Now, they are huddled together in an old apartment with no bath and a shared toilet. "You should work too, old lady. If you hadn't been so set on driving me away with your mistreatment, none of this would have happened. It's because you couldn't keep your legs closed. If you hadn't come back, I could have gotten along with my daughter-in-law." Their constant bickering can be heard day and night. Even if Emily hadn't come back, Susan never really liked me. But Emily's return probably made her feel like she had an ally, leading them both astray. Not that I feel sympathy or pity for them. After living for more than half a century, not being able to control such behavior is Susan's own fault. As for Emily, there's hardly anything worth saying. She broke the agreement to pay the alimony in installments and was demanded to pay in full. Now, I hear she borrowed money from dangerous people and has caught their attention. Even after going through such hardships, there seems to be no growth. it's likely they'll continue to scrape the bottom, never abandoning their naive ways. The renovation of our family home was completed without issue. The old house had its charm, but the modern exterior of the new home isn't bad either. We made the entire first floor barrier-free. My father-in-law insists he can't be a burden to us, fighting against the decline of physical strength as if it's the enemy of aging, and has started going to the gym. He's become more youthful, and my husband, not wanting to be outdone, has made weekend walks a routine. We're living very fulfilling days now.